Dr. Varick stood before the observation window, all four of his arms crossed in various configurations of disapproval as he studied the beam on the other side of the reinforced glass. His silver-scaled skin reflected the harsh laboratory lights, creating shifting patterns that betrayed his agitation. The human sat quietly on the examination table, appearing remarkably calm for someone who had volunteered to be a test subject in the galaxy's most advanced combat enhancement program. "Explain to me again," Varick said, turning to his assistant, "why we're wasting valuable research time on a species that hasn't even mastered controlled fusion." His primary breathing sac expanded with an exasperated hiss, a sound that made the junior researcher beside him flinch. Researcher Clicks, her translucent membrane flickering with nervous energy, pulled up the relevant documentation on her holopad. "The Interstellar Scientific Coalition mandate requires us to include at least one representative from each spacefaring species in the program, sir. The humans qualified last month when they established their first extrasolar colony." "Barely qualified," Varick muttered, his upper left hand adjusting the sensitivity controls on the observation window. "Their colony is hardly more than an outpost on a marginally habitable rock." Through the window, Sarah Matthews maintained her composed posture, though her lips curved slightly upward. The audio sensors were sensitive enough to pick up the faintest sounds from the examination room, and Varick knew she could hear every word. The fact that she showed no offense at his dismissal only irritated him further. "Have you reviewed her preliminary scans?" he asked, pulling up the holographic display with a gesture. The human's biological data floated before him in shimmering detail. Single heart, no redundant organs, limited regenerative capabilities. How did this species survive long enough to achieve spaceflight? Clicks's membrane rippled with an unexpected pattern of scholarly excitement. "That's actually fascinating, sir. According to their submission documents, humans evolved on what they classify as a death world. Their planet features extreme temperature variations, multiple apex predators, and regular natural disasters. Their adaptability appears to be their primary survival trait." Varick's secondary eyes narrowed while his primary set remained fixed on the human. "Adaptability without biological optimization is merely delayed extinction." Researcher Clicks. "Our program is designed to enhance natural advantages. We can't enhance what isn't there." Sarah Matthews chose that moment to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the communication system. "Dr. Varick, I couldn't help but overhear your concerns. Perhaps a practical demonstration would be more convincing than my biological scan." The presumption of the human addressing him directly caused Varick's scales to flush a deeper silver. He was about to remind her of proper protocol when she continued. "After all, the Coalition mandate requires you to at least attempt the enhancement process. Why not start with the baseline testing?" Varick felt his scales bristle. The human was right, of course, which only served to irritate him further. The mandate didn't just require inclusion, it required a genuine attempt at enhancement. His research facilities funding depended on strict adherence to Coalition guidelines. "Very well," he said, activating the testing chamber protocols with sharp, precise gestures. Researcher Clicks, prepare the standard baseline assessment. Let's see what we have to work with. He paused, then added with a hint of malice, begin with endurance parameters at level 3. Clicks's membrane pulsed with alarm. Sir, the standard starting level for new species is 1. Level 3 is reserved for species we expect to show actual potential. Varix cut her off. If the human wishes to demonstrate capability, let her do so at a meaningful level. Unless you object, test subject Matthews. Sarah slid off the examination table with fluid grace that seemed to contradict her supposedly inferior biology. No objection, Doctor. Level 3 is perfect. There was something in her tone that made Varix's scales ripple with unease, not fear or concern, but something that sounded disturbingly like anticipation. The examination room began to transform around her. Metallic panels slid aside, revealing a complex obstacle course designed to test the absolute limits of any species' physical capabilities. Gravity plates activated, environmental controls shifted, and holographic targets materialized throughout the space. The baseline assessment consists of 5 phases, Varix explained, his tone clinical: endurance, strength, speed, reflexes, and tactical processing. Most species require rest periods between each phase. You may, of course, request a pause at any. No need, Sarah interrupted, already moving into a starting position. I assume the course is self-explanatory. Varix flicked his secondary eyes in annoyance. The obstacles will light up in sequence. Your goal is simply to complete each section without failure. At level 3, you have a maximum of 3 attempts per obstacle before automatic disqualification. Environmental conditions will adjust randomly throughout the test. Any questions? Just one, Sarah replied, bouncing lightly on her toes in a motion that seemed more suited to recreation than preparation for a serious scientific assessment. Are you recording all this? For the research archives? Of course. Everything is monitored and recorded according to coalition protocols, Varix stated flatly. Beginning countdown. 3, 2. Perfect, Sarah said, and there was that tone again. The one that made Varix's scales itch. You might want to pay close attention, Doctor. This should challenge some of your assumptions about human biology. Before Varix could respond, the starting signal pulsed through the chamber. What followed would force him to rewrite substantial portions of his research on species capability and adaptation. Sarah Matthews moved through the course like water flowing around obstacles, her movements efficient and purposeful. When the gravity increased suddenly to twice standard, she adjusted her gait without breaking stride. When the temperature dropped to near freezing, her performance didn't falter. Impossible, Varix muttered as she completed the endurance phase in record time, showing barely any signs of fatigue. Check the environmental controls. She must be getting some form of assistance. All systems functioning normally, sir, Clicks reported, her membrane now pulsing with patterns of scientific excitement. She's already beginning the strength assessment. Indeed, Sarah had moved seamlessly into the next phase, approaching the first of several weighted challenges. The testing chamber's artificial intelligence automatically scaled the weights based on the subject's mass and demonstrated capability. Varix watched in disbelief as she systematically exceeded every calculated maximum. Their muscle density shouldn't allow for this, he said, more to himself than to Clicks. The scans showed normal protein structures, nothing exceptional. Sir, Clicks's voice held a note of awe. I don't think it's about the muscles. Look at her technique. She's using leverage and momentum in ways the system wasn't designed to account for. She's outsmarting the testing parameters. Varix's scales flushed dark with academic indignation. That's not the purpose of the assessment. This is supposed to be a straightforward measure of biological capability, not a test-off. He cut himself off as Sarah began the speed trials, her movements becoming even more unusual. Instead of following the standard patterns that the course was designed to test, she created her own routes, using the obstacle course's architecture in ways that the designers had never intended. She transformed the standardized testing chamber into what appeared to be an elaborate momentum puzzle, building speed through carefully planned sequences of movements. Researcher Clicks, Varix said quietly, his scientific curiosity finally overcoming his initial dismissal. Begin recording detailed notes. It appears we may need to reconsider our understanding of what constitutes biological advantage. Through the observation window, Sarah Matthews continued her demonstration, and for the first time in his long research career, Dr. Varix found himself wondering if perhaps he had been asking entirely the wrong questions about species development and survival. The research facility's central laboratory hummed with unprecedented activity as Dr. Varix reviewed the test results for the 4th time. His scales had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, a sign of deep intellectual distress among his species. Researcher Clicks hovered nearby, her membrane rippling with barely contained excitement as she processed new data streams. "Run the simulations again," Varix commanded, all four arms moving in agitated patterns across his workstation. There must be a logical explanation for these results. In the adjacent testing chamber, Sarah Matthews sat cross-legged on the floor, casually sipping from a container of water, as if she hadn't just shattered 3 decades of established research parameters. The monitoring systems continued to record her vital signs, which had already returned to baseline levels despite the intense physical demands of the previous trials. "Sir," Clix's membrane was now strobing with urgent warning patterns. "The containment field is becoming unstable. The interaction between the gravity plates and the energy barriers is creating feedback loops in the main power grid." Below them, Sarah Matthews moved through the chaos with impossible precision, each movement perfectly calculated despite the increasingly unpredictable environment. The testing chamber had become a swirling maze of energy barriers, gravitational anomalies, and environmental extremes, all shifting and recombining in patterns that defied analysis. "Fascinating," Varix muttered, his scientific curiosity momentarily overwhelming his growing concern. "She's not just adapting to each individual challenge. She's predicting how they'll interact with each other. The human is mapping chaos itself." A sudden surge of energy caused the observation window's protective shields to activate automatically. Several council members retreated from the viewing area, their various physiologies displaying clear signs of distress. Elder Zentel's crystalline form vibrated with frequencies indicating severe alarm. "Dr. Varix," she commanded, "shut down the protocol immediately. The facility's safety systems were not designed for this level of strain." But Varix's attention was fixed on the human's movements below. Sarah had begun using the chamber's malfunctioning systems against each other, deliberately triggering energy surges to neutralize gravitational anomalies, turning the facility's growing instability into a tool for survival. "Don't you see?" He gestured with all four arms at the unfolding scene. "This is exactly what we needed to observe. Under genuine pressure, facing truly unpredictable challenges, she's demonstrating capabilities that—" A massive power surge interrupted him, causing the entire facility to shudder. Warning klaxons began blaring as multiple systems approached critical failure simultaneously. "The containment field is collapsing." Clix's voice cut through the growing chaos. "If it fails completely, the feedback from the gravity plate's cold." The rest of her warning was drowned out by the sound of emergency bulkheads slamming shut throughout the facility. The testing chamber's environmental controls failed catastrophically, releasing a wave of conflicting temperature and pressure variations that would be lethal to most known species. Evacuation protocols initiated, the facility's AI announced with artificial calm. All personnel must proceed to designated safety zones immediately. But Varix remained at his station, his scales now pale with a mixture of scientific fascination and growing horror. Below, Sarah Matthews had stopped moving through the obstacle course. Instead, she was studying the failing systems with an intensity that made his secondary heart skip a beat. "Dr. Varix," her voice came through the stuttering communication system, somehow still perfectly calm. "Your containment field is about to fail completely. When it does, the gravitational backlash will crush everything within a 100-meter radius. However, if we reroute power from the main grid through the testing chamber's energy barriers, we might be able to create a temporary containment zone." "Impossible," Varix responded automatically, even as his hands moved across the control interface. "The power requirements would be exactly equal to the energy being generated by your malfunctioning gravity plates," Sarah interrupted. "But we'll need to time this perfectly. Clix, can you access the environmental control subsystems from your station?" Clix's membrane pulsed with surprise at being addressed directly, but her scientific training took over. "Yes, but the controls are barely responding. The system architecture wasn't designed for this kind of manipulation." "Perfect," Sarah replied, and there was that tone again, the one that had been unsettling Varix from the beginning. Not confidence, exactly, but something deeper. The sound of someone who viewed impossible situations as intellectual puzzles waiting to be solved. When I give the signal, divert all remaining power from life support to the energy barriers. Dr. Verix, you'll need to synchronize the gravity plate's failure with the power surge. Time it wrong, and the backlash will take out half the facility. This is absurd. Elder Gentle's voice crackled through the emergency communication system. You can't possibly expect us to trust the fate of this facility to a human's improvised solution. With all due respect, Elder, Sarah responded, her movements becoming more precise as the chamber systems continued to deteriorate around her. Your current options are my improvised solution or guaranteed destruction. And honestly, this isn't even close to the most desperate situation I've had to adapt to. Remarkable, Verix found himself saying, scientific curiosity finally overcoming his initial skepticism. She's not just adapting to the system, she's forcing the system to adapt to her. Sir, Clix interjected, her membrane now displaying patterns of both alarm and excitement. I think you should see this. I've been analyzing her biological readings throughout the trial. Her neurological activity suggests she's not just responding to the challenges, she's actively learning from them. Each obstacle she encounters adds to her understanding of the system's limitations. Verix stared at the new data streams, his forearms unconsciously moving in patterns of deep thought. She's treating our enhancement program like a puzzle to be solved rather than a test to be passed. He paused, watching as Sarah initiated yet another impossible sequence of movements. We designed this facility to push subjects to their limits, but she's pushing back, forcing us to confront the limits of our own understanding. The testing chamber systems continued to struggle, trying to categorize and respond to movements and strategies that defied their fundamental programming. Warning indicators flashed across the control panels as more subsystems approached their operational limits. Dr. Verix, Sarah called out, her voice still frustratingly composed despite the chaos she was creating. I think your equipment might need some upgrades. Shall we move on to something more challenging? Verix's scales shifted through colors that had no direct translation in human visual spectrum, a complex mixture of scientific fascination and professional anxiety. More challenging, he repeated, all four hands gripping his workstation. You're already exceeding our highest difficulty parameters. Sarah paused in her systematic deconstruction of the testing chamber's obstacles to look directly at the observation window. Doctor, these are just physical challenges. If you really want to understand human capability, you need to test our problem-solving under genuine pressure. These controlled environments barely scratched the surface. Something in her tone made Verix's scales ripple with unease. It wasn't a boast or a challenge. It was a simple statement of fact. And somehow, that was far more disturbing than any display of physical prowess. The Emergency Science Council meeting had been going for 3 hours, and Dr. Verix's scales had cycled through so many stress patterns that several of his colleagues had expressed concern for his health. The holoprojections of his latest test results filled the circular chamber, casting the assembled researchers in an eerie glow. This is unprecedented, Council Elder Gentle stated, her crystalline form refracting the light of the data streams. In all our years of enhancement research, no species has ever exceeded the testing parameters to this degree. Exceeded isn't the correct term, Verix responded, his forearms moving in agitation. The human didn't just surpass our parameters, she rendered them meaningless. Our entire methodology is based on the assumption that biological limitations can be measured and quantified. She proves that assumption false with every test. The assembled council members shifted uncomfortably. Decades of research, countless breakthroughs in species enhancement, and billions in funding rested on those very assumptions. Researcher Clix, who had been granted special permission to attend, pulsed her membrane in a pattern indicating she had relevant data to share. If I may, she began, her scientific excitement barely contained. Our latest analysis suggests that human adaptation isn't just physical. Their problem-solving capabilities appear to increase in direct proportion to the level of challenge they face. It's as if stress itself serves as a catalyst for enhancement. In the observation chamber below the council room, Sarah Matthews was undergoing yet another series of tests. This time, she was navigating a maze of energy barriers that randomly shifted and reconfigured. The system had been designed to test tactical processing under pressure. Instead, she was using the barrier's own energy patterns to predict their movements, turning what should have been a reflexive challenge into an exercise in applied physics. "Watch this section," Varix commanded, highlighting a particular sequence. The energy matrix is supposed to be unpredictable, yet she's anticipating the patterns before they form. She's not just solving the puzzle, she's deconstructing the underlying rules of the system itself. "Fascinating," Elder Gentle commented, her crystalline structure vibrating with scientific interest. "But also deeply troubling. If one human can so thoroughly challenge our understanding of biological limitations, what does that suggest about their species as a whole?" More importantly, another council member interjected, their gaseous form swirling with concern. "What are the implications for the enhancement program? Our funding depends on delivering measurable improvements in species capability. How can we enhance what we don't understand?" Varix's scales shifted to a deep, determined silver. "There is one option," he said, his tone carrying the hint of something that made Clix's membrane pulse with worry. "We design a new test, not just a physical or tactical challenge, but a comprehensive trial that pushes beyond anything we've attempted before." The council chamber filled with murmurs of concern and interest. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Varix?" Elder Gentle asked. "A simulation that combines all aspects of our testing protocols simultaneously. Physical demands, tactical challenges, environmental extremes, and complex problem solving, all interwoven in ways that even a human couldn't possibly anticipate or prepare for." "Sir," Clix interjected, her membrane flashing warning patterns, "creating such a test would require overriding multiple safety protocols. The strain on our systems alone cold." "Our systems are already straining," Varix cut her off. "Every time she enters the testing chamber, she finds new ways to push beyond our supposed limitations. At least this way, we control the parameters of the challenge." Through the observation window, Sarah had completed another impossible sequence of movements, causing several monitoring systems to shut down in protest. She looked up at the council chamber, and despite the distance, Varix could have sworn she was smiling directly at him. "The council will need time to consider the implications," Elder Gentle began, but Varix was already moving to the control interface. "Time is precisely what we don't have," he said, his hands dancing across the controls. "Every moment we delay is another moment she spends understanding our systems, finding their weaknesses, proving our methods inadequate." "Dr. Varix," Clix tried again, "at least let me run some preliminary simulations. The interaction of multiple testing protocols could create unexpected." "Unexpected is exactly what we need," Varix interrupted. "She adapts too quickly to any single challenge. We need to create something even she can't anticipate." In the testing chamber below, Sarah's voice came through the communication system. "I couldn't help but overhear, Doctor. Are you finally ready to try something interesting?" The casual confidence in her tone caused Varix's scales to flush dark with determination. "Initialize Protocol Omega," he commanded, overriding the system's safety warnings with practiced efficiency. "Combine all existing testing parameters into a single adaptive sequence." Warning lights began flashing across the control panels. The testing chamber's walls shifted and reformed as multiple systems activated simultaneously. Energy barriers sparkled into existence as gravity plates powered up, environmental controls engaged, and holographic combat scenarios materialized. "Sir," Clix's membrane was now pulsing with genuine alarm. The system wasn't designed to run all protocols concurrently. The power requirements alone cold. Sometimes, Varix cut her off, watching as the testing chamber transformed into something far more complex than its designers had ever intended. "We need to exceed our own limitations to understand those of others." In the chamber below, Sarah Matthews stood calmly in the center of the growing chaos, her expression showing nothing but interest as the challenges materialized around her. "Now this," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the increasingly unstable communication system, "is more like it." The assembled council members watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as Dr. Verix initiated a sequence that would either validate their entire understanding of species capability or shatter it completely. "Begin final testing phase," Verix commanded, his scales now pulsing with patterns that reflected both scientific determination and a hint of something darker, something that looked almost like desperation. "Let's see how well humans adapt when there's no pattern to adapt to." The testing chamber erupted into controlled chaos, and Sarah Matthews stepped forward to meet it, her movements suggesting that this, perhaps, was what she had been waiting for all along. The first warning signs came exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds after Protocol Omega initiated. The testing chamber's power grid began fluctuating in ways that the facility's architects had never anticipated, sending cascading surges through multiple systems simultaneously. Dr. Verix watched as emergency indicators shifted from yellow to red across his control panel, his scales darkening with the first real traces of concern. "Sir," Clix ventured, her membrane pulsing with scholarly patterns, "I've completed the 7th simulation." The results remain consistent. The human's performance wasn't a statistical anomaly. She's demonstrating capabilities that our models simply didn't account for. Verix's secondary eyes narrowed while his primary set remained fixed on the scrolling data. "That's precisely what concerns me, Researcher Clix. Our models account for everything. Every known species, every documented adaptation, every evolutionary advantage. We designed this program to enhance natural capabilities, not—" He gestured at the results with all 4 hands. "Whatever this is." Sarah's voice came through the communication system, still irritatingly calm. "If it helps, Doctor, I'm actually performing below my maximum capacity. Your environmental controls are quite limiting." The statement caused Verix's scales to flush dark with a mixture of academic indignation and scientific curiosity. "Explain," he demanded, turning to face the observation window. "Your testing parameters assume that species operate within fixed biological limits," Sarah said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. "Humans don't work that way. We adapt in real time, pushing past supposed limitations when necessary. The more challenging the situation, the more we adapt." "That's biologically impossible," Verix stated flatly. "Adaptation occurs over generations, through genetic selection and evolutionary pressure. No species can simply choose to exceed its physical limitations." Sarah smiled, that same enigmatic expression that had been frustrating Verix throughout the testing. "Why don't we try something more challenging? Something that might actually require me to push my limits." Before Verix could respond, Clix's membrane suddenly flashed with alarm patterns. "Sir, the environmental control system is detecting unusual feedback patterns. The human's last endurance trial seems to have affected the primary calibration matrix." "Impossible," Verix muttered, but his hands were already moving across the control interface. The readings confirmed Clix's assessment. Somehow, the human's unconventional approach to the obstacles had created stress patterns that the system wasn't designed to handle. "Fascinating," Sarah commented, examining the testing chamber's walls with renewed interest. "Your equipment assumes that subjects will approach challenges in predetermined ways. When faced with unexpected solutions, it tries to recalibrate based on flawed assumptions." "The assumptions aren't flawed," Verix snapped, his scales now shifting through colors that indicated deep scientific distress. "They're based on comprehensive studies of every known spacefaring species. The parameters are absolute." "Nothing is absolute when it comes to human capability," Sarah replied. She walked to one of the testing chamber's more challenging obstacles, a gravity-variable climbing wall that had never been fully conquered at maximum settings. "For instance, your system assumes that increased gravity makes vertical movement more difficult in a linear fashion. But what if the subject uses the increased gravitational force to their advantage? Before Varix or Clicks could question her meaning, Sarah began to move. She approached the wall at an angle that the system's designers had never anticipated, using the enhanced gravity to build momentum through a series of controlled falls and rebounds. Each movement flowed into the next, transforming what was supposed to be a test of raw strength into an intricate dance with gravitational forces. That's not. You can't. Varix's usual scientific eloquence failed him as he watched the human turn his carefully designed testing chamber into what appeared to be a physics playground. Sir, Clix's voice held a note of urgency. The system is having trouble processing her approach. The adaptive algorithms are trying to adjust the difficulty, but her responses don't fit any established patterns. Indeed, the testing chamber's automated systems seem to be caught in a loop, trying to increase difficulty levels based on success rates, while simultaneously attempting to compensate for what it perceived as equipment malfunctions. The result was a cascade of recalibrations that made the obstacle course more unpredictable with each passing moment. "Shut it down," Varix ordered, his scales now pulsing with patterns of genuine concern. "Before she damages the entire system." "I can't, sir," Clicks replied, her membrane flashing with emergency patterns. "The override commands aren't responding. The system is fully engaged in its adaptive protocols." Through the observation window, Sarah continued her demonstration, each movement seemingly calculated to push the testing chamber's capabilities to their limits. She wasn't just completing the obstacles, she was systematically proving the inadequacy of their entire testing methodology. Before anyone could respond, a massive power surge ripped through the facility's main grid. Emergency lights flickered and died as critical systems began shutting down in sequence. Now, Sarah's command cut through the chaos with crystal clarity. "Reroute power on my mark. 3, 2, 1. What followed was a display of coordination that would later require 17 different research papers to adequately describe. Sarah moved through the failing testing chamber like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of controlled destruction. Each motion perfectly timed to the facility's dying systems, each command synchronized with the cascading failures. The containment field collapsed exactly as she predicted, but instead of catastrophic gravitational backlash, the energy was channeled through a complex network of deliberately created feedback loops. The testing chamber itself became a massive energy sink, absorbing and redistributing power in ways that its designers had never imagined possible. When the emergency systems finally stabilized, the facility's main computer estimated that Sarah's improvised solution had prevented damages that would have cost upwards of 60 million credits to repair. The testing chamber itself was a write-off. Its systems burned out beyond recovery, but the rest of the facility had been saved. In the aftermath, as emergency teams swarmed through the building and damage assessment protocols initiated, Dr. Varix found himself staring at the human through a damaged but still functional section of the observation window. His scales had taken on a color that none of his colleagues had ever seen before, a complex mixture of scientific humility and dawning understanding. "How?" he finally asked, all four hands pressed against the reinforced glass. "How did you know that would work?" Sarah Matthews looked up at him, covered in coolant fluid from a ruptured environmental control system, but otherwise appearing completely unfazed. "I didn't," she replied simply. "I just recognized the patterns in your system architecture and improvised a solution based on available resources. That's what humans do. We adapt, we overcome, and most importantly, we don't accept failure as an option when lives are at stake." And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his most advanced testing protocols, Dr. Varix began to understand that perhaps he had been studying the wrong thing all along. The true mystery wasn't how to enhance human capabilities. It was understanding how they had become so extraordinarily capable in the first place. 3 months after the incident that nearly destroyed the Galactic Federation's premier enhancement research facility, Dr. Varix stood before the Science Council again. His scales had finally settled into a new default pattern, one that his colleagues now recognized as indicating profound intellectual transformation. "Members of the Council," he began, his four arms moving in carefully measured gestures, "I come before you today not to defend my actions, but to present our findings from what we now call the Human Adaptability Event." The chamber's holographic displays activated, showing detailed analyses of Sarah Matthews' performance during both the official trials and the subsequent crisis. Elder Gentle's crystalline form refracted the data streams in complex patterns that indicated intense scientific interest. "Our fundamental mistake," Varix continued, "was in treating human enhancement as a problem to be solved rather than a process to be understood. We approached their capabilities as fixed variables waiting to be optimized, when in fact they represent something far more remarkable, a species that has evolved to thrive on the very concept of adaptation itself." Researcher Clicks, now promoted to Senior Adaptation Specialist, stepped forward. Her membrane displayed patterns of professional pride as she initiated the next set of data streams. "Our subsequent studies have revealed that human neural plasticity increases exponentially under pressure. The more challenging or dangerous a situation becomes, the more innovative their problem-solving capabilities become. More importantly," Varix added, "they appear to permanently retain these adaptations. Each challenge they overcome doesn't just solve the immediate problem. It expands their baseline capabilities for future challenges." The council chamber filled with murmurs of discussion as the implications became clear. A species that treated limitations as temporary obstacles, that converted stress and danger into catalysts for growth. It challenged every assumption about biological enhancement that the Federation had developed over centuries. "What you're suggesting," Elder Gentle observed, her crystalline structure vibrating with frequencies of deep consideration, "is that our entire approach to species enhancement has been fundamentally flawed. Instead of focusing on optimizing existing capabilities, perhaps we should be studying how to nurture this kind of adaptive potential in other species." "Precisely," Varix confirmed, his scales shifting to patterns that indicated passionate scientific conviction. "And Lieutenant Matthews has agreed to help us redesign our entire program." As if on cue, Sarah Matthews entered the council chamber. She moved with the same fluid grace that had first caught Varix's attention, but now he recognized it for what it was, not just physical prowess, but the embodiment of human adaptability. Every movement reflected countless generations of evolution on a planet that had tried its best to kill her species, only to forge them into something remarkable instead. "The new program," Sarah explained, addressing the council with characteristic directness, "will focus on teaching adaptive thinking rather than just enhancing physical capabilities. We'll create scenarios that force subjects to think creatively, to push beyond their perceived limitations, to understand that impossible is often just a matter of perspective." "And you believe other species can learn this?" A gaseous council member swirled with skepticism. "This adaptive capability seems uniquely human." "Every species adapts," Sarah replied with a smile that Varix had learned to recognize as genuine enthusiasm rather than the smugness he had first assumed. "Humans just had the good fortune to evolve on a planet that never let us get comfortable with our limitations. We learned to see challenges as opportunities, dangers as chances to improve, and failures as data points rather than endpoints." Varix stepped forward, his scales now displaying patterns of scientific excitement that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. "We've already begun modifying the facility's training protocols based on these principles. Instead of fixed parameters and predetermined outcomes, we're creating adaptive scenarios that evolve in response to the subject's approaches." "The early results have been promising," Clicks added, her membrane pulsing with patterns of academic satisfaction. "Several species have shown significant improvements in problem-solving capabilities when exposed to these new methodologies. It's as if understanding how humans approach challenges has helped them break free of their own self-imposed limitations." The council chamber's displays shifted to show footage from the new training programs. Beings of various species could be seen tackling problems in ways that defied their traditional capabilities, finding solutions that combine their natural advantages with newly developed adaptive strategies. Perhaps most significantly, Verix concluded, "We've discovered that this human approach to adaptation isn't just about survival or enhancement. It's about growth, about pushing the boundaries of what's possible, about refusing to accept current limitations as permanent constraints." Sarah nodded, adding, "On Earth, we have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. But humans learned to go beyond mere necessity. We invented new challenges for ourselves, pushed into hostile environments simply because they were there, and turned the very concept of limitation into a starting point rather than a boundary." Elder Gentle's crystalline form resonated with frequencies indicating deep approval. "It seems, Dr. Verix, that your initial skepticism about human capabilities has led us to a breakthrough that could revolutionize our entire understanding of species development." "Yes," Verix agreed, his scales shifting through patterns that indicated both humility and excitement. "Though I admit, the path to this understanding was not quite what I expected." He turned to Sarah, all four arms moving in a gesture of scientific respect. "Sometimes the most valuable data comes from experiments that fail spectacularly." Failed experiments, successful adaptations, it's all about perspective, Sarah replied with that now familiar look of someone who saw challenges as puzzles waiting to be solved. "The question isn't whether we'll face obstacles, it's how we choose to view them. Are they walls to stop us, or steps to climb higher?" As the Council moved to formally approve the new direction for the enhancement program, Verix reflected that perhaps this had been the most human adaptation of all, learning to see failure not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of a new understanding. In trying to study human limitations, they had instead discovered that the only real limits were the ones they placed on their own imagination. The future of species enhancement would no longer be about pushing against fixed boundaries, but about learning to see boundaries themselves as challenges to be overcome. And in this new approach, humans would not be test subjects, but teachers, showing the galaxy that adaptation itself was perhaps the greatest enhancement of all.